Um, so it's a great pleasure to introduce our two protagonists today, Wendy Holden and Eva Clarke. Yes, hello everyone. I was thinking a couple of weeks ago when we set this up, when the event at the Austrian embassy was those few years ago. So I think it must have been around the time of publication, around 2015.
2000. I mean, the book came out in 2015 originally, and then I think that Austrian embassy event was 2016, I believe.
2016, which was, I mean, a fascinating evening at the residence. I think just being in I think it's like a lot of the events, when you're in the opulence and the grandeur of the Austrian embassy and the subject matter combined, made for a really special evening.
Yeah.
And it forced me to, and this is just me really showing off here, dig out my copy of
the hardback.
Hardback, very different.
Hardback. And I was going to go further and say it is inscribed, and it is, but it's not to me. So I don't know whose copy I've got, but it's on my bookshelf, so I'm claiming it.
All right.
And it was great to reread bits of it again in the lead up to this event. Not least so that if they're in the unlikely event there were no questions, I've got one or two of my own later on. So it really is a remarkable story, a remarkable collection of stories, I should say, a remarkable book. And you would have seen, those of you who have joined us, the description of the event today. So I don't want to interfere too much with the conversation that we're about to hear. Suffice to say that this, and it's just not saying it because you're here, it's one of the more remarkable sets of stories that I've come across in this field, and survivor stories. And of course, it's timely because we've just passed the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Mauthausen. I think I'm not giving too much away by wishing Eva a belated 75th birthday, because the two things are very much related. But the milestone anniversary we've just had, and of course this was supposed to be the year of all these events, and there were whole things planned for the VE Day and Bergen-Belsen, and of course Mauthausen, Buchenwald, and so on. So we're very mindful of that, and we tried to get as near as we could to the date to hold this event because of the topicality and just it's tempting to say the timeliness of it, but I think these subjects are ever timely because the themes in here, and of course the story needs to be told several times because it has huge emotional and educational impact as well. So with all that, I shall stop talking and introduce Wendy Holden, the author of All the Survivors, and Eva Clarke, the daughter of one of the three babies who features.
No, not the daughter of one of the babies, the daughter of one of the mothers.
You are the baby. You're the daughter of
one of the
mothers who had a baby, who feature in the book. And before I say anything else wrong, I'm going to stop and hand over to you both.
Okay. Right.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know about you, but I'm in Suffolk and it's rather miserable today, so I don't think we're missing very much. And it's lovely to see you all. It's always a wonderful delight to connect with readers or potential readers and to tell this incredible story, these incredible stories. This book, this is the 75th anniversary edition, 75th anniversary of the end of the war, the liberation of Mauthausen, and the births of the three babies. This came out during lockdown, this special edition, and but it's in paperback, not hardback, so it's cheaper. And it's been quite a journey for us all. But let me start at the beginning. My name is Wendy Holden, and I am an author of more than 30 books. I was a journalist for 20 years, 10 of those years on the Daily Telegraph, and for a long time I was a foreign and war correspondent. I have spent my life writing about remarkable people in many ways, and in particular with my books I've focused on inspirational and remarkable women, but there are very few books that have been more inspirational or remarkable than this one. What I look for in all my books is the humanity in the inhumanity, because I quite often write about horrendous situations and horrible wars and the Holocaust, of course. So it's wonderful to find episodes of the kindness of strangers and the points at which terrible things are changed because of the kindness of strangers or because of the humanity of others, and of course, indeed, of their courage. Born Survivors tells the true story of 3 young mothers who gave birth in unspeakable circumstances in the concentration camp system, and miraculously, all 3 mothers and all 3 babies survived. Astonishingly, Eva is one of those babies, and we have been traveling all over the world. It's now been published in 22 countries and translated into 16 languages, and we've been everywhere talking about it and thoroughly enjoyed every minute, from the Austrian embassy to small groups of students in schools. That it has the same impact wherever we go, because it is the first time ever in the history of the Holocaust that any book has ever been written about babies born in the camps that survived. So it is completely unique from that regard. Thanks to me and to Michael, now everybody knows Eva's age. She's 75. She was born in April and in 1945, and she's 75, and the other babies are all 75 as well. They survived largely because they were born in the waning days of the Second World War. And I don't tell people their ages to embarrass them. I tell them because it's really important to think that here in front of us, here with us today, is somebody in the flesh who, within living memory, Hitler and his Nazis intended to murder. And that has a very great impact, particularly on children and the younger generations when we speak in schools. They really are very moved by that. Thanks to me and my connection with Eva, which actually came about through HET, I should say, the Holocaust Educational Trust, we've managed to put these stories together, and they have now, the 3 babies have now made me their honorary sibling, which is a huge honor, and I really feel like I'm part of this collective family. The other 2 babies.
Can I interrupt? And this is one of my habits that fortunately Wendy doesn't mind, I don't think. But
I like all the interruptions I can get.
Yeah. What I just want to add that by sheer chance, all 3 of us babies, we're all only children. And so we definitely feel that we have siblings now ever since we met. And yes, and Wendy is our honorary youngest sibling. That's it.
I like the fact that I'm youngest.
Could I make a comment? Could I make a comment on her age? Hello?
Yes.
Oh, well, I was born in just a few years after the baby boom started, so they're just a couple of years separating us, and I'm just amazed at how different the worlds we were both born in were different and separated by such a short period of time.
Indeed.
Thank you for that. Can I ask that perhaps we can bring that point back in when we have the Q&A.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't know how.
That's fine. It's fine. I think we just let Wendy and Eva carry on for now, and then we'll bring in that point and maybe others that we want to raise a bit later on.
Thank you very much. I first came across this story by chance. I was reading something late at night online in 2013. It was an obituary of a woman in Canada who had died in her 80s, and she had been in Auschwitz and she had given birth there, and her baby had been taken away and murdered. And she'd had to live with that her whole life. And it occurred to me that I'd never read anything before about any babies who'd survived the camps. And then I figured, well, of course, I can't read anything about them because none of them did. But I decided to have a look, and trawling through the internet, I eventually came across the name of Anka Nathan, who is Eva's mother, and her incredible story of survival and of Eva's survival. And I found out that I could not only see Eva and speak to her, but she lived very close to me. She lives in Cambridge in England, and I live in Suffolk. And honestly, if she'd lived in Sydney, Australia at that point, I would have gotten a plane to go and interview her. But I was very fortunate that she lived so near. She very kindly invited me to her house for the day. And I think it's fair to say, Eva, that we had an instant connection.
We clicked.
And we clicked immediately. And we had a very emotional day together, actually, where she told me her story. And I very sadly had just missed her mother by 6 months, who died at the age of 96, 6 months previously. But after the very emotional day we had together, I told her that I believed she was the only baby to have survived, and that I would be very honoured if she would let me write her mother's story. And she reached out and touched my arm and said, "I've been waiting for you for almost 70 years."
Mm.
And that was an incredibly moving moment. But she then had a little chuckle, because she said to me, "Actually, I'm not the only one. I thought I was all these years until 2010. And then I discovered that there were two others whose mothers had been on the same journey, and had also given birth at that towards the end of the war."
Shall I tell people how
Yes,
I found out?
please.
Right, all my life, my mother had always thought that we were the only ones and that I was the only baby, even though she knew that some babies had been born in Mauthausen. But as she was very proud of the fact, she said, yes, but they were born after liberation. You were born before liberation. It's a big difference. And anyway, but when the Americans liberated the camp, they took hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and I'm quoting my mother with that figure. But I have never been able to find one single photograph. And I went through all the usual channels that you might research. And then I did discover that it was the 11th Armored Division of the American Army, and I wrote to their Veterans Association, and I sent them a 4-generation photograph saying, something like, "Without you, we wouldn't exist." And I got a magazine back with our picture on the front cover, and on the inside was Hannah's story. And I went to my mother. Hannah's one of the other babies, and I went to my mother and I said, "You're not going to believe this." And she said, "No, I don't believe this." And because of the wonderful internet, we were emailing very quickly. And then a couple of months later, we both found Mark, the other baby, because his son was trawling the net again to find out more details about his father's birth, etc. And again, he started emailing us. And then we all met for the very first time in 2010, when we were all 65. We met in Mauthausen for the 65th commemoration. And that first day, when we sat in one cafe in Linz, and we just sat there all day, laughing and crying and talking about our 3 mothers. Both of their mothers had died some years before, but my mother was still alive. And well, perhaps I shouldn't say any more at this point, but yeah, I'll leave the rest to later on.
It was wonderful to hear about the other 2 babies. I then had the decision, of course, as an author, whether I write just Eva and Anka's story, or whether I write the story of all 3 mothers and all 3 babies, which would obviously be 3 times the work. But I connected with them initially online, and then in person. I flew to America to meet them. And the minute I met them, I knew that I had to encompass all 3 in the book, because really it's very different story. They all have very different stories, although they have similar stories. Obviously, they're all young women, all pregnant, all arrived from the ghettos and towns and cities of Europe, and came to Auschwitz at roughly the same time. But nevertheless, they had different backstories, and that was a wonderful element to the book, I think, because it gave us the different threads and different experiences prior to them being on the same journey. And then, of course, after the war, their experiences were very different. And that's really, I think, what's been the great appeal of the book, because we can't possibly identify with 6 million, but we can identify with 3 young mothers. And we can particularly identify with these 3 young mothers because they were all young and beautiful and eloquent and intelligent, and the kind of women that I would have loved to have had for friends. They were smart, they were sassy, they were beautiful, and until the Nazis invaded their countries, they had everything to live for. So who were these women? Well, the first was Priska, and Priska's parents ran a small cafe in central Czechoslovakia, kosher cafe, which suited her very well because she had a terribly sweet tooth, and she used to eat the pastries that were left over. She was a very gifted student and planned on being a teacher of languages when she grew up. The Nazis invaded, and for various complicated political reasons, the Jews in Slovakia weren't immediately rounded up, but they did decide as a family to go to Bratislava, to the city, to have a better chance of not being so easily identified as Jews. And it was there that she met Tibor, her future husband, who was also Jewish, a journalist, very, very handsome, very debonair, and very swanky suits, and smoked a pipe. and they fell in love and they got married under Nazi occupation, which seems a little strange to us now. But of course, none of them thought that the war was going to go on for very much longer. They expected that the Allies would come through any day and release and save them all, which sadly didn't happen. Over the course of the next 2.5 years, Priska became pregnant 3 times, and 3 times she lost the baby, which is a very sad situation to have happened, but it makes it even more remarkable that the 4th and final baby was the one that she was able to hang on to, even though she ended up being in the most unspeakable situations when she gave birth to him. They were celebrating Yom Kippur in their apartment in Bratislava in September 1945 when they were suddenly, the Nazis burst in with Slovak police and arrested them and sent them away first to another camp, but then on to Auschwitz. And they knew at that point that Priska was pregnant again. And as they were—
Wendy, sorry, you said 45. It was September 44.
Thank you so much. That's why I need you on every level. And in the cattle wagon, pressed into that cattle wagon with 50 or 60 other people, and Priska, 2.5 months pregnant, she and Tibor clung to each other in that cramped space, very, very frightened. And they decided that they would name their unborn child. And they decided on the name Hannah for a girl and Mishka for a boy. And then when the wagon doors opened, they arrived in the hell of Auschwitz. Rachel was the second mother. She grew up in a small town called Pabianice in Poland. She was the eldest of 9 siblings. Her mother was pregnant pretty much throughout her childhood, one baby after another. And of course, being the eldest, it was Rachel's duty and job to help with the younger children, change the nappies, do the feeds, look after them, do shopping and so on. Actually to the point that she thought she would never want a child of her own because she'd spent her whole childhood looking after other people's, her siblings, her younger siblings and babies. She decided that she was going to marry very young, she was going to marry very rich, and she was going to have a very nice life and raise money for Zionism. She was a passionate member of the Young Zionist group. And so she pretty much achieved all of that. I think she left school at 15. I think she was married by 16. And she married somebody called Monique, whose parents were very wealthy mill owners. And they had a very nice life. Their family had an apartment in Warsaw. They moved between their hometown of Pabianice to Warsaw, and everything was going very well until, of course, the Nazis came and they were rounded up and put into a series of ghettos and ultimately ended up in the Łódź ghetto, which was actually the last to be liquidated. And they had a very difficult time there. It didn't matter how much money you had. It didn't matter who you knew. It didn't matter that there were 9 or 10 small children. They were treated equally appallingly. They had to work for the slightest bit of food, and they had to live in fear of their lives, to the point that the Polish police and the Nazis used to come into the ghetto on a frequent basis and take away 1,000 to 2,000 people randomly and transport them east. That's all they knew, a labor camp in the east where they would be enlisted to help with the German war effort. They didn't know what that was, but they knew it was frightening, and they knew it was different, and they knew that they might not be together. And they also knew that nobody ever seemed to come back from that. And her father, Rachel's father, was a very canny man. And in this one room where the entire family were crammed in, he built a false wall at the end of that room. And in front of it, he put a dresser, a big wooden dresser. And at the bottom of the dresser, there was a door, and that was an entrance into the false space behind the wall. And so every time they heard the trucks pull up outside, and they heard the jackboots on the stairs, and they heard people banging on the doors and people screaming and crying, he would get all the children to go through the back door of the dresser and hide in the wall behind, including Rachel, who by then was 2 months pregnant with Monique's child. And in this way, they managed to evade capture and transportation to Auschwitz for several weeks until finally, sadly, they were all tricked. And they were all, apart from Monique, who wasn't there that day, taken away and put into cattle wagons and sent to Auschwitz. And unfortunately, only Rachel was the one immediately to survive from her family, because all the younger siblings were ultimately killed along with their parents. Anka, Eva will now tell you about what happened to her parents, Anka and Bernd.
My father, Bernd Nathan, was German, Jewish, and in 1933 he realized it would be sensible to get away from Berlin, which is where he was living at the time. And he managed to get to Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, and he thought that was far enough to be safe. It wasn't, but if he hadn't have come to Prague, he wouldn't have met my mother, and I would not be talking to you today. He'd been an architect and interior designer, and he met my mother, who had been, up to that point, she was a law student at the Charles University in Prague. But when the Germans invaded, they closed all the Czech universities. Nobody was allowed to study. So they married in on the 15th of May of 1940, which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. And they said my mother always said that it was quite difficult living under all the Nuremberg laws. But on the other hand, she said it was a great advantage that they were both young, strong, because they just sort of took it on the chin, and they thought, well, if this is the worst it's going to get, we can cope with all these privations and restrictions. And on the whole, I think young people were far better equipped, if you like, to cope with them. And the first year of their life, they lived a sort of a normal, of their married life, they lived a relatively normal existence. But at the end of November, the beginning of December of 1941, that is when they were both sent to Terezín or Theresienstadt, the first camp in Czechoslovakia. My father was sent first. You were told you could take a small suitcase. You were advised to take warm clothing. You were also advised to take pots and pans, which gave them some indication that they thought they were being sent to some sort of labor camp where they would be able to cook, they'd be able to look after themselves. And a few days later, my mother received, oh yes, I should have said, one of the first questions I was asking my mother when she was telling me about her experiences was I was asking her how she was taken prisoner, because I had all these images in my mind. You know, I'd read the Diary of Anne Frank, I'd seen films, I'd seen documentaries, and I had this vision that the middle of one night, soldiers would have been banging on the doors, dragging people out of their beds. And I said to her, you know, is that what happened to you? And she said, no, nothing like that. She said, we received a card in the post. And that card said that on a certain day, at a certain time, we would have to report to a warehouse in Prague, near one of the mainland railway stations. And that's what happened. My father received his card first, and he left. And sometime later, my mother received her card, and then she left as well. And I have to tell you, because it's one of my sort of anecdotes that I like to think makes the story come even more alive, especially to students in schools. Not only was she carrying her handbag and her suitcase, she was also carrying a large cardboard box, and that contained, she said, between 2 or 3 dozen donuts. And I said to her, why? Why were you carrying donuts? Didn't you have enough to worry about? And it was very sensible, that she had no idea where the next meal was coming from, so she was bringing food. Anyway, so my parents, they were amongst the first people who were sent to Terezín, because they were both young, strong, and well capable of work. And they were sent there in the first transports to help sort of set it up. They didn't have any option, but that's why they went there that early. And unknown to them, they were to spend the next 3 years in Terezín, which is a remarkably long, a very unusually long period of time. Because on the whole, Terezín was a transit camp for the death camps, because there were various categories of people who would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. And amongst those groups of people would have been the old, the sick, mothers with children, pregnant women, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled. But as I said, my parents were well capable of work, so they remained in Terezín for 3 years, and my mother said luck had an awful lot to do with it. But at the end of September of 1944, their luck ran out, because that's when my father was sent to Auschwitz. Should I talk about my brother, Wendy, at this stage or not? Yeah, okay. So before I get to that part of the story, well, Wendy will carry on with the experiences the others had in Auschwitz, along with my mother. In 1943, no, when families first arrived in Terezin, the sexes were segregated, men from women. Well, in 1943, my mother discovered that she was actually pregnant. And when I was about, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, no doubt when it would have been at its most embarrassing, well, I'm sure you will all agree it's embarrassing at any age. I said to her, so how come you got pregnant? To my father. And she replied in a very clever way. She said, well, she said, it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly, as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences. End of story. But it had very, very serious consequences, because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death, because they were trying to annihilate, they were trying to murder every single member of the Jewish race. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant, but the reason for the segregation was so that they could not get together, the women could not become pregnant. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over to be killed. Except they didn't use the word kill, they used the word euthanasia. My mother had never heard the word euthanasia. She had to go and ask somebody what it meant. In the event the other 4 babies were born, we don't actually know what happened to them. We assume they all perished in Auschwitz. When my brother, Jiří means George, he was born in February of 1944. He was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life and my mother's life, which is a very strange thing to say. But had my mother arrived in Auschwitz holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again, this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show. So again, she lived to see another day.
Thank you, Eva. It's extraordinary, isn't it, to think that these families, these couples would consider or risk getting pregnant at a time of war, at a time of Nazi occupation, and indeed in Eva's case in a concentration camp, in Anka's case. But we have to remember the timing of it all. Towards the end of 1944, World War II was ending for huge swathes of Europe. They knew that the Allies had come ashore at Normandy, Paris had been liberated, the Russians were closing in from the east, they had access to news through various prison guards. They were young, they were in love, they were hopeful, and they fully believed that any minute now they would be liberated and be able to get back to their lives. But unfortunately, that wasn't to be the case, and not for a very long time yet, because after their horrible experiences in the towns and ghettos of various parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, all 3 women, each of them 2 months pregnant, arrived in Auschwitz between August and October 1944, where they each came under the eagle-eyed scrutiny of Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. It was a very well-oiled machine by then. It had been operational Auschwitz for many, many years. And so the minute the wagon doors opened, usually at night, with bright lights shining in their faces, they were pulled out with screams and shouts and dogs barking, and they were ferried and funneled along a long corridor of barbed wire, which it felt to them like hell on earth. In the distance, chimneys were belching smoke, and that left a horrible cloying sensation in the throat and nose. They marched past furnaces. They had no idea what all that meant, but it just seemed to be unbelievably hellish, and they couldn't imagine what was going to happen to them. They were sent to a place at the back of Auschwitz-Birkenau called the sauna, which was a building where they were stripped literally of everything that would identify them as human beings. All their possessions, their hair, their clothing, and any belongings that they had, any precious things they'd kept, for example, rings or wedding rings and so on. And they were brutally shaved of every hair on their body by prisoner functionaries as the guards leered. They were then marched outside in absolutely naked, about 500 women at a time, to stand and wait for inspection in cold, wet clay. and they were so so much in shock. They didn't know where they were, what was going to happen to them. They didn't recognize each other. Anka heard a little voice of her friend say to her, where are you, Anka, where are you? And she said, if that's you, Mitzi, I'm standing right next to you. Because they didn't recognize each other. They all looked exactly the same with no hair. And they spoke of the shock of the cold on their heads without hair, to suddenly have no hair. When their hair had been their defining feature, it was something that they spent a lot of time and effort and care on. And standing in that cold, wet clay, waiting to be inspected. And of course, they didn't know what the inspection meant, but the inspection literally meant life or death, because Joseph Mengele took great pride in his work. And he worked even on his days off. And even when his wife and son were visiting and staying in a house in the camp, and he marched up and down, looking at all the women that had arrived and deciding whether or not they were good stock, as he called them. And the ones that he thought were good stock were sent to the right, which meant life up to a point. It meant life in as much as it was going to be slave labor until death, probably. Because the Germans knew they were losing the war and they needed all the slave labor they could get. And if they were pregnant, disabled, wearing spectacles, old, anything that was likely not to make them optimal stock for slave labor, then they would be sent left. And he indicated this left or right with the flicking of a leather glove that he flicked left or right very casually. Sometimes it was a riding crop that he had in his hand, and he would flick it, twitch it, left or right, and his guards would know exactly what that meant, and the women that were to be sent left were literally pulled out of the line and sent to a corner, and their fate is unknown. They were either sent straight to the gas chambers, or they were sent to his experimentation wings, where he did appalling experiments on women and children. He was impeccably dressed. He was very handsome. They all spoke of him. They remember him being very handsome. And he was smiling as he asked each of them, "Are you pregnant, pretty lady?" Sometimes if he suspected they were pregnant and they denied it, as all these three mothers did, he would quite literally squeeze the breast very hard to see if any milk betrayed their pregnancy. And if it did, then they would go left. Amazingly, all these three mothers, terrified three mothers who didn't know each other, who didn't know there were others there who were pregnant, managed to evade that detection. They all denied that they were pregnant, and they were all sent right, which meant going back into the sauna and being given clothes to wear. These clothes were taken from an enormous pile, some of it still warm, that had been taken from those who'd been stripped and sent to the gas chambers. And the prisoner functionaries, the people who worked for the camp commandants, literally just threw them random clothing, and it really was random. So they might get an evening gown or a nightdress or a child's dressing gown or a pair of man's trousers or a shirt. It was completely random. Fortunately for all three mothers, they each received dresses. In two cases, they were old ladies' dresses, so they were baggy, they were black, and they also received shoes, and that was the most important thing of all, because the winter of 1944-45 was the bitterest in European history in 15 years. And if you didn't have shoes when you were going to be marching to and from your slave labor factory to the barracks and back again, you would die of frostbite. If you had shoes that were too small, you could die, because you would get blisters that would have no medical treatment, that would become infected, and they would never ever heal, so they would get sepsis and die of that. If you had shoes that were too big, you could die, because you might lose it in the snow and the ice, and then you'd only have one shoe and you'd still get the frostbite and the other problems that went with it. Incredibly, they all got shoes, they all got clothes, and they were sent with 1,000 frightened women by train to Freiburg in Saxony, where they were imprisoned in a large porcelain factory that's still there. We've been there, me and the three babies, we've all been there at the invitation of the German government, and it's a very spooky and sinister place. They were forced to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, riveting and making wings for a new aircraft that the Germans were developing, which they hoped would help them win the war. And somebody remarked from that camp, it might have done if they hadn't employed Jews who hated them into making it, because they did everything they could to sabotage the whole production. These were women who had never really done any manual labor in their lives, but suddenly for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, holding heavy riveting machines that took 2 of them to take the weight and reverberated through them without any ear defenders when they were pregnant, and living largely on a diet of water. They had so-called coffee for breakfast, which was just a metallic black liquid, so-called soup for lunch, which if they were very lucky, they might just get a little piece of onion or potato in it, with a tiny piece of black bread, like rye bread, that quite often had weevils in it. And again, so-called coffee for supper. When you think of what pregnant women these days are encouraged to eat and have and go through, it's extraordinary that they manage to keep hold of their babies and keep themselves and the babies alive as long as they did. They each dropped dramatic amounts of weight and went down to 5 stone at full term. So although they had these baggy dresses, it really didn't matter so much because they only had very small bumps. They slept on wooden bunks infested with lice. Lice was a part of their daily life. It's in their coffee, in their bread, in their food, in their clothing. And the clothing that they'd been given in Auschwitz was the same clothing they wore without any proper washing facilities for the next 7 months. So it actually got to the point where some of them couldn't even stand their own smell. They had to trudge a mile through snow and ice in this clothing every single day, wearing these wooden clogs and horrible shoes that caused blisters that never healed, and had little or no help from anybody outside. They were convinced that they would be worked to death and that they would die before their babies came to be born. They truly thought they'd been abandoned. And then in February 1945, Dresden was bombed 25 miles away, and they saw the Allied planes coming in and flying overhead. And for the first time, they thought, my goodness, we might actually be saved. The Germans locked them in the factory. They went down to the bunkers and they told them to draw the blackout curtains and stay hidden. But the women threw open the windows and threw back the blackout curtains and declared, come and get us, because they would rather have been killed at the hands of the Allied bombers than worked and starved to death by the Nazis. Unfortunately for them, the Allies didn't come for them then. The planes bombed Dresden and then they went home and there was no salvation. And so the weeks and months rolled by, and ultimately on April the 12th, Priska was the first to go into labour. She gave birth to a little girl. If you remember, they were on the wagon and she and her husband Tibor had decided Hannah for a girl, Mishka for a boy. So she gave birth to a little girl weighing under 3 pounds. She called her Hannah. She came out with her fists at her head, which Hannah always said she thinks it was because of the noise of the riveting machines when she was in the womb. And Hannah was very, very poorly from the start. Priska believed that she would probably be taken away from her, but she wasn't. The guards left her alone, and all she had to do, she had nothing to give her, nothing to clean her with, nothing to prepare her, so she stuffed her inside her filthy dress, the same dress she'd been wearing for all those months, and incredibly she had a little milk. And the only reason that baby Hannah wasn't taken away from Priska that day was because the commandant knew that the following day he was evacuating the remaining 900 women and putting them on a train to send them to be gassed at Buchenwald, to be killed at Buchenwald. And so she was put on the train along with Rachel, heavily pregnant, Anka, heavily pregnant with Eva, and they were earmarked for Buchenwald. But luck plays a huge part in this story, and the next day Buchenwald was liberated. So instead of a two-day journey to Buchenwald, where they would have been killed, they then endured a 17-day journey without hardly any food or water, and no comfort or compassion from anybody, as the train of death snaked its way down through Czechoslovakia en route to Austria and Mauthausen, which was one of the last surviving concentration camps, and one that was big enough to take and execute not only these 900 women, but another 2,000 prisoners, concentration camp prisoners, whose train had been coupled to the back of theirs. It was on that journey on April the 20th that Rachel gave birth in a filthy coal wagon to baby Mark, also weighing 3 pounds, also painfully thin, very, very unwell. Again, she had nothing to give him, nothing to feed him with, really. She was able to put him in a piece of cardboard and hold him to her. And she also thought that she would not survive the journey, and that would be the end of it. And Anka, heavily pregnant at the other end of the train, had a very different experience, which Eva will now tell you about.
Yes, but before I tell them about Mark's umbilical cord.
Yes, well, when Rachel gave birth to Mark, she didn't believe that he would survive, but she didn't have anything to cut or deal with the umbilical cord, and somebody suggested that she bite through it, which she would have done, but then somebody was able to find a rusty razor, and they used that to cut the umbilical cord, and that's how she was able to keep hold of that baby boy.
Right, as you can already gather, it was quite a train journey. My mother was on, we think, on one of the last of these open coal wagons. The whole train consisted of open coal wagons, so filthy and open to the elements. And the train at one point stopped, and the doors were opened, the dead bodies thrown out, and a farmer walked by, and he saw my mother. And she always described herself, well, first of all, she always said that she could never forget the sheer shock on his face. She described herself as looking like a scarcely living pregnant skeleton. As Wendy's already mentioned, none of the mothers weighed more than 5 stone, 35 kilograms. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk. But there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised this whip to shoulder height as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm and he let her have the glass of milk. And she reckoned that saved her life. Who knows? But what I have to tell you about what happened when this train stopped, my mother thought that the train had stopped in the middle of the countryside, because that's all she could see were greenery, forests, I should think. But the train had actually stopped in a small town called Horní Bříza in Czechoslovakia. And we are forever grateful to the very brave station master there, whose name was Mr. Antonín Pavlíček, and we would dearly like him to be proclaimed a righteous Gentile, but I don't think it's going to happen, but it should. The train stopped in this small town, and Mr. Pavlíček saw this nightmarish vision of these people on the train and could hear them and the crying, and well, one can't imagine what it must have been like. And overnight, there was a factory in this town, and overnight he got everybody to bake something like 1,000 bread rolls, small bread rolls. And he brought them the next morning for the prisoners. And he was very brave, because the Germans said to him, "Give them to us, we'll give them to the prisoners." And he said no. He said, "We will give them to the prisoners." And they did. They also gave some to the Germans. But anyway, the main thing was that he resisted them. And also in some of these bread rolls, some people had written messages. And the messages said things like, "Hang on, the war is almost over. Just keep going. You will live. You will survive." And the train went on. And the train eventually arrived in this place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen itself is a beautiful village on the banks of the Danube in Austria near Linz. The concentration camp was up the very steep hill behind the village. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock, because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz not knowing what that was, this time she knew, because she had heard about this appalling place from very early on in the war. And she said that the shock of seeing the name, she thought possibly provoked the onset of her labor. And she started to give birth to me on that coal wagon. She had to climb off the coal wagon unaided. She had to climb onto a cart because the prisoners who were not strong enough to walk up the steep hill, they had to get onto carts and they were pulled up by others. She had people lying all over her, people with, typhus and typhoid fever. And she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labor, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been. And she always maintained that she was screaming not only because she was in labor, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die. But I was born, and we both survived the experience. I was born, and I didn't move, I didn't breathe. And incredibly, the Germans allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner. And presumably they allowed it because they could hear the guns in the distance. And the doctor came and he cut the umbilical cord and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And there are 3 reasons why we survived. And the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April, 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas, so the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. So presumably, had the train arrived on the 26th or the 27th, none of us would have survived. The second indirect reason why we survived is because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And the last and the best reason why we survived is because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckoned she wouldn't have lasted much longer. All of us, or none of us 3 babies weighed more than 3 pounds. Do I stop there?
Yes,
Stop there.
thank you. You can see the timing, you can see how luck played such a huge part throughout. If they hadn't been forced to stop in that little town where the brave station master had been kind enough and brave enough to challenge the commandant and letting him feed them, they would have been in Mauthausen when there was still gas, and they would almost certainly have been killed. So it was an extraordinary happenstance that allowed them to survive long enough for that to have happened. And of course, that's the reason they survived and so many others didn't, because they didn't have that luck. And all the mothers, by the way, would say that it was down to luck that they survived. A lot of people have asked us, and I'm sure asked them during their lifetimes, whether or not they survived because of the babies inside them. But there were plenty of people who were pregnant, who had very strong and equally strong reasons to want to survive and be reunited with their families. And they didn't survive because they didn't have the same luck. So all 3 mothers were liberated by the Americans. They were dreadfully ill and thin and absolutely worn out with these tiny babies. But the Americans and the British were marvelous, as you know, with all the concentration camps, and they rallied and got them medical support and gave them food, and many died, unfortunately, of being given food because they'd been starved for so long that their bodies simply couldn't handle it. But we like to think that at least they died knowing that they were free. Unfortunately for all 3 mothers, they discovered that all of their beloved husbands were dead. Anka's husband, Eva's father, Bernd, was killed on the 18th of January 1945, shortly before the liberation of Auschwitz, and he was shot dead on a death march from Auschwitz. Priska's husband, Tibor, died on that same death march, and people who were with him said that he did not believe that Priska and the baby had survived, and he died of a broken heart, and he either gave up or was shot on that march. And Monique, if you remember, Monique was not rounded up on that last roundup in Łódź ghetto because he had been shot in the streets in Łódź. 2 of the mothers did not find out for a very long time what had happened to their husbands. And in fact, Priska, even though she knew that Tibor had died on a death march, she never married again because she always hoped that one day he would walk back in through the door. Incredibly, all 3 mothers went on. They decided to carry on with their lives. They had babies, they had a future. They thought, because of the babies, they'd lost almost everything they owned. They'd lost their homes, they'd lost huge numbers of their families. I think the total loss for the 3 families was something like 38 immediate family members had been killed. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, all gone, all killed by the Nazis. No homes, the clothes only that they were standing up in that they'd been given by the Americans after they were released, and had to call upon the kindness of strangers or relatives to take them in after the war and help them to start again, have a new life. But incredibly, all the 3 mothers decided to instill in their children a sense of positivity, a sense that they had survived something so miraculously that they needed to do something very important with their lives and go forward in a positive manner and not to have hate. At one point, Mark, who was taken to Israel initially before moving to America by his mother Rachel and her second husband, when he discovered what had happened and realized that the Germans had killed almost all of his family, he vowed that as soon as he was old enough, he would get a gun and he would go back to Germany and kill as many Germans as he could. And Rachel shook him by the shoulders and said, "No, Mark, you don't understand. They took everything from us. If you say things like that, then they will also have taken your soul." And so
Wendy, please tell them about the train. And Mark.
Oh, Mark's very funny, and he said that when he first grew up and he asked his mother where he was born, she said, well, you were born on a train, and he said, okay, cool. Because he thought that was a cool thing to do, and he likes to tell school children that story. And also I have to tell you that the sense of humor has stayed and remained with all three of the mothers throughout their lives, and I think it sustained them in many ways. Rachel at one point was watching Gone with the Wind in the cinema with her grandson Charlie, and at the worst point of the film where Atlanta is burning and Scarlett O'Hara is pulling her hair out, there's a momentary lull in the film, and this little Jewish voice of Rachel in the middle of the cinema said, they think they had it bad. It's just lovely, great sense of humor. But the women not only survived, they not only helped their children go forward in a positive way, but all of those three children who in many ways were refugees or near refugees in their lives have gone on to do wonderful things. Mark is an emergency doctor. He trains other emergency doctors. He does pro bono work. He does charity work. He lives in Wisconsin. He's a wonder. Hannah, who was saved by penicillin, one of the first civilians ever to be saved by penicillin, which was only available to the military initially. She then became a chemist, and she has spent her life testing drugs, quite often drugs for cancer, life-saving drugs. She's given back in an enormous way. And Eva has worked in education all her life, and since retirement, and I use that term lightly, she's worked tirelessly for the Holocaust Educational Trust and AJR and other people, talking about her mother's experiences so that people never forget. They are the voices of the voiceless, and in 5 to 10 years' time, there will be nobody left on this earth apart from these three babies who actually survived the Holocaust. And that's an incredible thought, and we have been so privileged to have Eva with us today, as I always am, and I thank you very, very much for listening.
And I want to express again, because I can never express it often enough, that the three of us babies are so grateful to Wendy for all the research that she did. Wendy retraced the steps of our mothers before the war, during the war, and after the war. And she has really written a most remarkable, absolutely remarkable book. And we're so grateful. I mean, and also we learned a lot, because certainly I know that I had some things that were incorrect in my story, because different people remember different things, but Wendy found the facts. And so we are very grateful. But I think we're now already 5 o'clock. We should allow people to ask questions.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. That was really just a sort of spellbinding, remarkable stories that you've captured there, Wendy, and also Eva helping to bring the story to life so eloquently. It's really a remarkable book, and for those of you who have not yet had a chance, I really do recommend it to you. I think I was also, just on a personal level, when Eva and I first met, I think it was the end around 1998, 1999, when I first worked at the Holocaust Education Trust.
Yeah.
And it sort of didn't dawn on, it struck me that here was, I mean, I dare I say it, flatter you in front of everybody. You're very young looking anyway.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course you were younger, well,
Then.
go back 20 odd years.
Yeah.
And compared to the survivors that HEC was working with, that were talking in schools, everyone looked older. And here was somebody who was also a survivor, but in a very different way. And it just opened my mind to being a survivor, still having that tag of survivor, but having had a very different experience. And of course, you touched on there about people who were slave labor survivors, slave laborers and survived that, or people in ghettos. And that's even before we talk about our refugee, kinder transport, domestic servant, people who'd served in the army. There's a whole range of people who had experienced Nazi oppression and had this tag survivor or refugee or victim. That's a horrible word, but it encompasses this whole range of experiences. I'll stop wittering. We're going to run over, but then we have to run over, because I do want to give people the chance to ask questions of our two guests here. I can see one item in the chat. Let me have a look.
Gertrude's got a hand raised.
Yeah,
was that?
I was just going to say Gertrude's got her hand raised.
Oh, okay.
And if people either raise a virtual hand or give a little wave, we'll unmute you. And then we can hear each question clearly. So Gertrude, do you want to I've just asked you to unmute.
Oh, Trudy. Okay.
Yeah, Trudy, sorry.
Okay.
No, you're still on mute. You need to unmute.
Bottom left-hand corner.
Curious. Managed to work it to put her hand up, and now she can't. Hang on. Click that one there.
Tried a few times.
Hmm.
Gertrude, bottom left-hand corner should be a little
Red line.
Yeah. You take that off? No.
Okay, let's go on to Trudy, you hold fire for a moment. I can see Victor's got his hand up or finger up. Hang on. Victor Trevor, you want to unmute?
Yeah, there we are. Thank you.
It's unmuted, is it?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I wanted to say it's a fascinating story. It's a very moving story, but there was so much of an element of luck. This came out very strongly, and it certainly happened in our case. I was born in Berlin by coincidence. My father also. He left Berlin in 1938 in order. That was after Kristallnacht, in order to get out of the risk, out of the danger of being arrested and murdered, as so many were in Berlin, and he managed to get a visa to come to London. When he heard that my Kindertransport, which was one of the last listed for September 1939, days before war broke out, which no longer left Berlin. And when he heard this, he came back to Berlin, and I'm afraid I can say it now, he did not make it. He was murdered in Sachsenhausen. But he came to Berlin. He collected after some delay a visa. He managed to get the collective visa of the Kindertransport separated, and we got as far as the Dutch border. War had broken out. They sent us back to Berlin. My father, I was in Berlin until 1942. I was one of the last pupils at the Jewish secondary school there, just before they closed. My father was one of the 250 people who were murdered in Sachsenhausen as a reprisal for what happened to the it became known as the Herbert Baum affair. Herbert Baum was a Jewish man who, together with some friends of his, felt something had to be done. They put a small, quite ineffective mob bomb at a Nazi propaganda exhibition in Berlin. It went off. It caused hardly any damage, but within a few days, 250 men, including my father, who was in was murdered.
Yes, there were some terrible instances, weren't there, Victor, of people being murdered as reprisal and being so close to escaping, and that features throughout this story, definitely. You know, the opportunities to go and to escape had been there prior to the war, but for various reasons they didn't happen. But then
Only one thing I wanted to add, and that is this: when this happened, and we were due to be deported, just like we've been told in the story told by Eva, my mother pulled herself together. We went into hiding in Berlin. We took a train. We found the smuggler who was going to take us to Belgium, as he did. And on that train, we had the Nazi police, the Kettenhund, as they're called. They had these big chains round their neck, the military police. And he came in and he said, passport. And of course, we had no passports, and we weren't supposed to be on the train, and we certainly didn't have any. That in itself was a capital offense, not to wear the yellow star. And there opposite us was whether this was a mistake on his part or whether he did it deliberately. But as this man said, passports, please, the Nazi, this man opposite us stood up and started shouting in a way that the Berliners are reputed to have, the Berliner Großschnauze, opened his mouth wide, and he said, I've had enough of this. We've already shown our papers. Oh, said the Nazi, when was that? Just after the train left. Oh, I'm so sorry. And he closed the, and that was it of my mother.
Wonderful.
My way of
Oh,
Thank you, Trevor.
Wait a minute. I think I can see Gertrude. Have you?
yes.
Unmuted?
Gertrude, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, well, it's really more of a statement. I come from Bratislava, and actually I have met Eva at the Holocaust Center in
Laxton.
yes.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, I always get amazed at the story of yours. I'm of course a good 20 years older than you. And the only other thing which I would like to say to Wendy, my mother is one of the 2 million who is still missing. And there is a story there. And I've done a lot of research, and she was on the last train out of the concentration camp called Sered. And I haven't been able to find her yet, but I'm still looking. And she's in the only cemetery, you probably are aware, there is a cemetery which is for women only at the end of that particular march on which she would have been.
But the Germans are actually doing some wonderful work with bone specialists and forensic pathologists. And they are retracing the steps. I'm sure you're aware. They're retracing the steps of these marches, and they are literally hand excavating the steps of the marches. And
were you aware that there was one death march which was women only?
Yes,
because very few women are aware of that. So I'm delighted, but she was on that one.
Well, I wish you every success. I really do.
Thank you. Anyway, it's nice. It was great to hear the story again. It's extremely moving, and it's just the luck of life.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who's got a question?
Ivy.
Ivy, yeah. Ivy, thank you. Oh, we can't hear you, Ivy. You are off mute, but you don't seem to have a speaker. We can't hear you.
Ivy she's written a note in the chat column.
All right, okay.
Perhaps she could write her question.
Okay.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, I took my headphones off. First of all, I'll be quick, but it is an honor and a complete pleasure to meet you. I feel like I'm going to cry. I was given this book after the shooting at my high school. I'm a Holocaust educator, and they, some of the different Jewish organizations wanted to replenish the things in my classroom because I couldn't go back in there. And I read this book and several times actually, and I couldn't even believe what I was reading. But what I wanted to ask you actually, and maybe you can make a comment, either Eva or Wendy, is how you were received when you went to the different high schools and spoke. But I also just wanted to tell you that recently, just less than a couple months ago, a bill passed in Congress here in the States that will make Holocaust education mandatory in all 50 states. I don't know if you're aware of that. And so it's more of an opportunity for your story to be told, which I take personal responsibility for now that I know your story, because once you hear a witness, obviously you become a witness.
I'm a witness, yes.
Yes.
Ivy, thank you so much. It's lovely to see you at last. Thank you very much for reaching out to me all those months ago as you did. Ivy had a very terrible experience in her school and witnessed the murder of many of her pupils in front of her. And we have connected, and I think you've connected with Mark as well.
Yes.
And his wife Mary, and that's been absolutely lovely, and it really is super to see you, and I'm very pleased about the new legislation. This book has been adopted in the curriculum in lots and lots of schools around the world. It seems to really appeal to year 9 and above, because they're able to identify with the whole story just by focusing on these 3 women, and because they're so young and because they had hopes and dreams as they do, they seem to have an immediate empathy with them. So it has been adopted by the curriculum, which we're very, very happy about, and we're always happy to talk to schools. And you know, as I've told you before, we will happily do a Zoom meeting with your students when you're able to organise that, or any of your group that you want to speak to. We'll happily do that. Thank you very much for coming on board today.
Thank you so much. This is really a privilege for me to hear.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm not getting anything through chat. Is anyone?
Just while Susan, just while you have a look, it's worth just adding for Wendy and Ivy that one of the events that we've done over Zoom is a series on teaching and learning about the Holocaust, which is, you can now find those sessions on our YouTube channel. And I mentioned that because that act, the act in the US that you mentioned there, Ivy, was referenced by one of the speakers who was from the US Holocaust Museum in Washington. And the adoption of those guidelines is something that we follow quite closely, and that we encourage organizations and people who apply to us for funding for education programs to reference, because the guidelines are internationally set. So it is something that we feel quite strongly about as well. And of course, telling individual people's stories as a way of teaching the subject helps bring the magnitude of the subject closer to on an individual level. That's obviously quite important.
Barbara is asking to ask a question. Barbara, I think you're unmuted already.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. That's been an amazing story to hear. It's something I didn't know much about, so thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
And my question is, at what stage, Eva, did you learn about your history? Do you remember your finding out about it, and what was that like for you?
Yes.
Well, big question, I'm sorry, but...
Sorry, no, that's fine. It's a question I do get asked on a regular basis. I've known my story from a very young age, because I was 3 years old when we came to live in the UK. And because I didn't have, that was with my mother and my stepfather, who was also Czech and also Jewish. Yeah. And because I didn't have any uncles and aunts and grandparents, cousins around the place, I was always asking my mother about her life growing up and her school days, her hobbies, and about members of the family. And interspersed with those very ordinary family stories, she would tell me quite instinctively in tiny snippets of her wartime experiences as she felt that I was able to cope with the details. So I can tell you the very first thing she ever did tell me. I was about 6 or 7, and I came home from school, and I noticed on the back of the kitchen door there was a brown suede shopping bag, and it had the letters A-N on it. My mother's name was Anna or Anka, and her first married surname was Nathan. Right. I did not have the surname Nathan because my stepfather officially adopted me before we left Prague. Yeah. So I said to her, right, what are those letters? And apparently she took a deep breath and thought, here we go. And she said, well, you've heard about the war. And I indicated vaguely because, sort of, because it was talked a lot about in the background between my parents and their friends. And she said, well, you had 2 daddies. And one daddy was killed in the war, now you've got another daddy. That's all she said. That's all she said. And because I was always asking her questions, she said I was basically like a sponge. So as I grew older, the replies became more and more detailed. And obviously, as I became older, I began to appreciate the enormity of what she'd been through, the tragedy that had befallen our family. And I'm so grateful, well, for everything in my life, but I'm so grateful for the fact that my mother told me very gradually, because I think if she'd never been able to talk about it. And if she had never said a word and then sat me down when I was 12 or something and said, I've got something to tell you, it would have come as an enormous shock.
Yeah. Yeah, she was sensitive, wasn't she?
Yeah, and she did it quite instinctively. I know I once met a child psychologist. It was actually on one of the HET trips to Auschwitz with students. And she was asking me the same question. And she said, well, anybody think your mother had been trained as a child psychologist?
I was thinking, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can't see any more questions, Michael. So back to you now.
Okay, thank you. Well, that really was a remarkable story to hear again. I mean, having had the privilege of hearing this before and hearing it again, it's also just interesting seeing people's reactions as you were talking, because this is a subject which is obviously close to our hearts at the AJR, but there's almost a danger of one story people out-storying each other with the remarkable tales of survival here. And it's so.
Well, one thing sorry to interrupt you, Michael, but one thing I say mainly in schools, I try to stress to students that every survivor story is unique. They may have common elements, but every story is unique. And I hope all the audience will forgive me if I say what my mother used to say, and that was, yes, but ours is a bit more unique.
But the first among equals. There was just one thing I would like to come back to, which is something that you touched on at the very end there, Wendy, about the future of, I suppose, the subject, because you talked about 10, 15 years or so. Well, let's caveat the whole thing by saying until 120, everybody lived to 120, but yes. Do you have your own views as to how I mean, the obvious thing to say is this is a sort of book that can be used in educational material to mitigate that survivors won't be talking in schools. They're not talking in schools at the moment. I mean, they're doing events like this, but is that something you see yourself being involved in directly, or certainly for the book in the future?
Well, I mean, I've written other books about war and the Holocaust, but this is definitely the one, I mean, it's the most important book I'll ever write, without a doubt. And it's also the one that's changed my life and my perspective enormously. And I have had an extraordinary journey with my babies since the book came out. The last 5 years have been really quite remarkable, tipped my life upside down in a very, very good way. Made me very humble, I think, about, never complaining about anything again. And also to have the opportunity to keep telling this story and to keep seeing the faces, to keep seeing the emotion, to keep, especially with the younger children, it's, the teachers say you can hear a pin drop when we're talking to them. They're completely transfixed, and that's rare with children. And yes, I'd love to say, of course, my book's a legacy work. It's timeless. It is timeless. And by the way, 5 years after publication, we've got a new edition, which is about the 14th edition anyway. And it's a special commemoration. And of course, it's going on and on and on. And that's the most marvelous thing of all. But the truth is that younger generation aren't reading as much as they used to. And so that's a big worry for people like me and for all of us, frankly, because if they're just going to be face down in their devices, then how are we going to connect with them? And yes, so the combination of that and the combination of the fact that there won't necessarily be any living, breathing survivors left is very important. So it's very important for us all to be a part of whatever we can be. I'm happy to do Zoom meetings every day if I have to keep the message going, to keep this message of compassion and understanding and tolerance out there, particularly in today's situation, today's crisis with refugees and racism and all the other things that are going on in the world at the moment that is, equally as terrible and horrible in their own individual ways. And I'm very impressed by some of the new initiatives, for example, the holograms of the survivors, the film footage where the children can now go into places and actually ask questions of people who are no longer alive. But they've done it very cleverly so that I think it's the Sher Foundation who have started it all. And it's an extraordinary thing to see because there is somebody sitting in front of them, almost real. And of course, for the children these days, so used to a virtual world, that's about as real as it'll be for them. And to be able to ask them questions, and because, as you've seen from Eva's experience and all the other survivors you speak to, the questions tend to be the same. You know, how did you learn about your mother's story, and what does this mean to you, and so on, and how has it affected your faith and forgiveness and these different things. So if you are aware of what the questions are likely to be, and then you film those people, the survivors are answering those questions, then they are still going to be there. And that's what we need, is innovation. And we need to harness this wonderful technology that we're using right now in any possible way to keep the stories going and to keep the memories alive, because we are so close to having all sorts of disastrous mini episodes of violence and racism and terrible things happening, particularly at the moment, because I think the pandemic has brought everything into sharp focus, and in America especially, and it's a very, very worrying situation. So I'm absolutely determined to carry on for the rest of my life, and as long as I have breath, to keep telling these stories and to keep the message and the spirit of these women alive.
And I echo everything Wendy says, of course.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, both of you. That was wonderful. And I suppose the word that keeps coming back to me is providence, that there was some divine intervention somehow that made it all possible. So we're very grateful that you've both been with us today, and also to taking some questions from our audience with us. Usually at this point, I'll just mark everybody's card for future events that we're doing, because you can have a look through the newsletter that we've got. We've got other book author interviews and conversations, and a whole range of cultural initiatives that we're delighted to present to you. And of course, also, if you are aware of anybody else, this is really addressed to within the membership, but if there's anybody else who's aware of people who could benefit from our services, we are primarily a social welfare organisation, and if you know of anybody that can benefit from our assistance or intervention, then please do let us know. I'm very grateful to my colleagues, Alex, who was on the call earlier, and of course Susan, who's still with us, for hosting and co-hosting and organising the tech for today, and ultimately, of course, to our speakers, to Wendy and to Eva, for sharing your story and your wisdom and your enlightenment with us today. So thank you all very much.
And thank you, Michael, and everybody.
I'm just going, if I may, I'm just going to do a very shameless little mini plug, if I may.
You can do a big one. It's unshameless and big.
This is a book called 100 Miracles, and it came out also in lockdown in paperback. And this is another book I've written, and this is the true story of a wonderful Czech musician called Zuzana Ruzicková, and her remarkable experience. She survived 3 concentration camps as a young teenage piano prodigy, and she then survived anti-Semitism under communist rule in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic, and was one of the most feisty, wonderful women I met. She was 90 years old when I was working with her in September 2017. I finished working with her on the Friday, and I told her I'd come back and see her in the February and go through the manuscript with her, and she died on the Tuesday after I left her, and her family said she stayed alive to tell me her story. And I have to stop there because I always cry when I say that, but she was a wonderful woman. And if you want me to discuss
it's a wonderful book, and another absolutely remarkable story.
Wendy, you are the keeper of all these transformative.
It's the greatest privilege, Michael. It's the greatest privilege. I have the most remarkable job. Every single day I get to spend time with wonderful, wise people who've had extraordinary experiences, and it's such a blessing.
Yeah, but it still takes the talent to transform it into a way to be presented for the public consumption. So great. Well, thank you both very much. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And I always say at these points, safe journeys home.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks.